There is a sound that Simone Carter says she will never forget for the rest of her life. It is not a scream. It is not a siren. It is not the sound of a hospital monitor or a courtroom gavel, or even the cry of a baby born 6 weeks too early into a world that almost took her mother before she had a chance to arrive in it. The sound that lives permanently in the back of Simone Carter's memory. The sound she says follows her into the quiet hours of the night when everything else has gone still, is the sound of a ceramic cup being set down on a wooden table. Soft, careful, deliberate. The sound of someone who had done it so many times that the motion had become muscle memory. The sound of routine. The sound of care. The sound, as it would turn out, of something so carefully constructed and so patiently executed that by the time anyone understood what they were actually hearing, 8 months had already passed and a woman was fighting for her life on a hospital bed in Columbus, Ohio, while the person responsible sat in the waiting room outside and asked the nurses if there was anything at all, that she could do to help. That woman's name was Dorothy Beaumont. She was 62 years old. She had silver hair she kept pinned back on Sundays and reading glasses she wore on a beaded chain around her neck. She baked sweet potato pie from scratch every Thanksgiving and kept a Bible on her nightstand and told everyone in her church circle that family was the most sacred thing a person could protect. She was, by every outward measure that the people around her could see, a devoted mother and a generous woman. And for 8 months, 243 mornings, she walked through the front door of her son's home carrying a canvas bag and a ceramic travel mug filled with chamomile tea that she had prepared herself before she ever left her house. She handed it to her pregnant daughter-in-law with a smile. She asked about the baby. She stayed for a little while. She straightened things up. And then she left. And the next morning she came back and did it all over again. For 8 months. Without missing a single day. What Dorothy Beaumont never told anyone, not her son, not her church sisters, not the neighbors who waved at her from their driveways every morning as she climbed out of her car, was what she was putting in that tea, and what she was hoping it would do to the woman who drank it every single morning without question, without suspicion, without ever once imagining that the hand offering the cup was the same hand engineering her destruction. Before we go any further into this story, we want to hear from you. Drop your city in the comments right now. We genuinely want to know where in the world MindMaze Stories is reaching today. And if you have not hit that subscribe button yet, please do it right now, because the story you are about to hear does not let up from this point forward, and you do not want to be the person who missed what comes next. Now, to understand what Dorothy Beaumont did and why she did it, you cannot start with the tea. You have to start years earlier, in a city where two people fell in love in the way that people sometimes do, fast and completely, and with the particular kind of certainty that feels, in the beginning, like it could survive absolutely anything. Including a mother who had already decided, before the first dinner was ever shared, that the woman her son had chosen was never going to be good enough. Not for him, not for the family, and certainly not for the child she had spent 33 years raising entirely in her own image, according to her own design, for her own purposes. Purposes that she had never once examined honestly, and that she would not examine honestly until a detective named Phyllis Mercer sat across from her in a small room and laid a purchase receipt on the table between them and asked her to explain it. Simone Carter, born Simone Elaine Washington, grew up in the Linden neighborhood of Columbus, Ohio. She was the second of 3 children raised by her mother, Gloria Washington, a woman who worked as a hospital administrator for 22 years and who operated her household with a combination of fierce love and absolute practicality that shaped every one of her children in ways they would not fully appreciate until they were adults themselves. Gloria Washington was not a woman who said things twice. She did not believe in softening hard truths or letting discomfort go unaddressed. She believed that the most loving thing you could do for someone was to tell them exactly what you saw, even when what you saw was something they were not ready to hear. Simone inherited that quality from her mother, though it would take the worst experience of her life to fully understand just how valuable it was and how much it would ultimately cost her not to have deployed it sooner. Simone was 31 years old when her world changed. She had a steady job as a dental hygienist at a practice she had worked at for 6 years. She had her own apartment, a savings account, a reliable car, and a close circle of friends she had known since high school. She was, by any honest measure, a woman who had built something real for herself, something entirely her own. Raymond Beaumont was 34 years old, tall, and easy to talk to in the way that certain people are, the kind of ease that does not feel performed, that does not feel like it is trying to impress you, that simply feels like being in the presence of someone who is genuinely interested in what you have to say. He was a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm. He had a good laugh. He called when he said he would call. He remembered small things, the name of Simone's childhood dog, the street she grew up on, the fact that she took her coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar. He was, in the early months, the kind of man that a woman like Simone had long since stopped expecting to find. For the first time in years, she did not lower her expectations. She let herself want something without immediately preparing for the disappointment. They dated for 14 months before Raymond proposed. He took her to the park near her childhood home on a Tuesday evening in October when the leaves were just beginning to turn, and he told her that he wanted to build something with her, something that lasted. Simone said yes before he had finished the sentence. She called her mother from the parking lot, still shaking, and Gloria Washington listened to the whole story and then asked one question. Just one. She said, "Baby, and I need you to really think about this before you answer me. What is his mother like?" Simone laughed. She told her mother she was being paranoid. She told her that Dorothy Beaumont was lovely, that she was warm, that she had welcomed Simone with open arms from the very first Sunday dinner. Gloria Washington listened. She did not argue, but she did not laugh either. And later, when Simone would look back on that phone call, she would understand that her mother had already seen something that she herself had not yet learned to look for. She would understand that Gloria Washington, who had spent 22 years watching human behavior from the administrative corridors of a hospital, had recognized something in Dorothy Beaumont at that first Sunday dinner that Simone's happiness had not yet allowed her to see. The question was not whether Dorothy Beaumont was warm. The question, the one Gloria had been asking in the careful, quiet way that wise mothers ask the questions that matter most, was who exactly that warmth was for. Dorothy Beaumont had been the undisputed center of her family's universe for 28 years, ever since Raymond's father, Harold Beaumont, died of a sudden heart attack at 54 and left her alone with a 6-year-old boy she would spend the rest of her life organizing herself entirely around. She was not, to be absolutely clear, a cruel woman by nature. She was not the kind of mother who screamed or threatened or made her feelings known through open confrontation. She was far more sophisticated than that. Dorothy Beaumont operated through warmth, through an excess of warmth that functioned, when you examined it closely enough, less like affection and more like a controlled environment. She showed up with casseroles. She remembered everyone's birthday. She offered to help with things before you had a chance to ask. And in doing all of these things, she ensured that everyone around her was always slightly in her debt, always slightly grateful, always slightly reluctant to push back against anything she wanted because she had been so very generous. And who would want to seem ungrateful in the face of all of that generosity? It was a system. It had worked for 28 years. And when Raymond Beaumont brought Simone Washington home for the first Sunday dinner, Dorothy Beaumont looked across the table at this woman her son was clearly and completely in love with and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent decades quietly managing the people around them, that the system was going to require some significant adjustments. The wedding was held on a Saturday in April. It was small, 63 guests, a venue in German Village, tulips on every table because they were Simone's favorite flower. By every account of the people who were there, it was a beautiful afternoon. Raymond cried a little when Simone came down the aisle and then laughed at himself for crying. And Simone laughed too. And Gloria Washington sat in the front row with tears running freely down her face and did not apologize for any of them. And then came Dorothy Beaumont's toast. She stood at the microphone in a burgundy dress she had clearly chosen with great care, and she smiled at the room, and she spoke about her son with the particular tenderness of a woman who has given everything to one person and wants the world to know it. She spoke about his sensitivity, his loyalty, his need to be truly understood by the person standing beside him. She said she prayed every day that the woman Raymond had chosen would be strong enough, to love him the way he deserved to be loved. She looked at Simone exactly once during the entire speech. And then she raised her glass and smiled, and everyone in the room applauded, because from the outside it had sounded like a blessing. From the inside, if you had been listening with the right ears, it had sounded like something else entirely. Gloria Washington set down her glass without drinking from it. She said nothing for the rest of the evening. She did not need to. The first year of the marriage was not without its difficulties, but it was not without its genuine happiness either. Simone and Raymond settled into a house in Westerville, a quiet suburb northeast of Columbus with good schools and wide streets, and the kind of neighborhood where people actually knew each other's names. They painted the living room together on a Saturday in June and argued pleasantly about the color and ended up with something neither of them had originally chosen that turned out to be exactly right. They had dinner parties. They argued about small things and resolved them. They built, in other words, the ordinary, beautiful texture of a shared life, which is a thing that requires constant tending and which, when it is working, is one of the finest things two people can do together. Dorothy Beaumont came for Sunday dinners. She was pleasant. She brought food. She complimented the house in ways that managed to simultaneously suggest improvements. She called Raymond on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, calls that often lasted an hour, and Simone, who was a fair-minded woman, told herself that this was simply what close mothers and sons did, and that she had no reason to read anything troubling into it. She told herself this with the particular determination of a woman who genuinely wanted to believe it. And for a while, because she was trying hard, and because Raymond was trying hard, and because the life they were building together was genuinely good, she almost managed it. It was in the second year of the marriage that things began to shift in ways that were difficult to name, but impossible to ignore once you had started noticing them. Dorothy began arriving unannounced on weekday mornings. Not every morning, not yet, but often enough that Simone began feeling a low, persistent unease about her own front door, which is not a feeling any person should have in their own home. She rearranged Simone's kitchen once while Simone was in the shower, moving things to positions that Dorothy found more logical. She offered parenting opinions before Simone was even pregnant, framed always as gentle suggestions and delivered always in front of Raymond, which meant that disagreeing with them felt, in the architecture Dorothy had carefully constructed, like disagreeing with the family itself. She told Raymond, on more than one occasion when Simone was within earshot, that his wife looked tired, that she seemed overwhelmed, that he should keep a close eye on her. Not because Dorothy was concerned about Simone, but because she understood, with the instincts of someone who had spent 3 decades studying the internal mechanics of one man, exactly which words would make Raymond feel responsible for managing his wife rather than standing beside her. Simone noticed all of it. She brought it to Raymond carefully, choosing her words with the kind of precision that women who love difficult men learn to use. Not because they are weak, but because they understand that the truth, delivered without that precision, will be heard as an attack on the wrong person. Raymond listened. He acknowledged that his mother could be a lot. He promised to speak to her. And then he did not speak to her. Or if he did, whatever he said was so gentle and so qualified that Dorothy Beaumont absorbed it without changing a single thing about her behavior, which suggested that whatever Raymond had said had not been nearly enough. This pattern, Simone raising a concern, Raymond acknowledging it, nothing changing, repeated itself enough times over the following months that Simone began to understand something that she did not yet have the language to fully articulate. She was not in a conflict with her mother-in-law. She was in a conflict with a marriage in which her husband's first loyalty had never actually shifted. Raymond Beaumont loved his wife genuinely and completely. He also loved his mother in a way that had never been examined, never been questioned, and never been recognized for what it actually was. Not love in the healthy sense, but dependency, obligation, and 28 years of a dynamic that Dorothy had built so carefully and maintained so skillfully that Raymond could not see its edges from the inside. And then Simone got pregnant, and everything that had been simmering beneath the surface of that household came to a point so fast that it left almost no time to prepare. Simone was 8 weeks along when she found out. She sat on the bathroom floor for a long time after looking at the test, not because she was unhappy. She was not unhappy. She was overwhelmed in the specific way that enormous good news can overwhelm you when it arrives faster than you were ready for it. She had wanted children. She and Raymond had talked about it. But wanting a thing and being suddenly, undeniably, biologically committed to it are two different experiences, and Simone needed a few minutes on that bathroom floor to let the distance between them close. When she came out, Raymond was in the kitchen making coffee, and she told him, and the way his face changed in that moment, The way the ordinary morning fell away and something real and open took its place was one of the things she would hold on to later in the hard months, when she needed to remember that the man she had married was in there somewhere beneath everything that had been layered on top of him. They called Gloria Washington first. Gloria cried. She said she was going to start knitting immediately, which she had never done in her life, and then she laughed at herself and told Simone she loved her and to call her doctor in the morning. It was a perfect phone call. It was the last fully uncomplicated moment Simone Carter would have for a very long time. They told Dorothy Beaumont over dinner 3 days later. She stood up from her chair when Raymond finished the sentence. She clasped both hands in front of her chest and closed her eyes for a moment. And when she opened them, she looked not at Simone but at Raymond, and she said, finally, something to hold on to. Something, not someone. Simone heard it. She felt the word land in a specific place inside her chest, a place that she recognized as important, and she made a mental note of it the way a person files away something they are not yet ready to fully examine. Something. The baby, before it had been in the world for even a week of being known about, had already been reduced by Dorothy Beaumont to a function, a purpose, a thing that was going to serve something that Dorothy needed. Simone could not have told you in that moment exactly what that something was, but her body understood it before her mind did. Her body had always been smarter than she gave it credit for, which was a fact that would prove, in the months ahead, to be the one thing standing between her and a far worse outcome than the one she eventually survived. Dorothy moved quickly after the pregnancy announcement. Within a week, she had opinions on the hospital. She preferred a different one than the OB practice Simone had already chosen and trusted. She had opinions on the nursery colors, delivered as suggestions, but repeated enough times that they functioned as instructions. She had opinions on diet, on sleep, on the particular brand of prenatal vitamins Simone was taking, which she mentioned twice were not the ones she would have chosen. She began calling Raymond every morning instead of twice a week. Calls that Simone could hear from the other room, long and detailed, Dorothy's voice coming through the phone in the way that certain voices do when they are doing more than simply talking. When Simone mentioned that she found the daily calls difficult, Raymond said his mother was just excited. When Simone mentioned it a second time, Raymond said she was being sensitive, that pregnancy hormones were hard, and that his mother meant well. That was the moment. Not the gasoline, not the iron gates, not any of the dramatic things that would come later. That was the moment Simone Carter understood that she was in a more serious situation than she had allowed herself to believe. Because a man who tells his pregnant wife that her concerns are hormones has already chosen a side. He has simply chosen it quietly enough that he can still pretend, to himself and to everyone watching, that he has not chosen at all. And then Dorothy made her offer. She came over on a Sunday afternoon, sat down across from Simone at the kitchen table, and said it in the warm, practical tone she used for everything, the tone that made generosity and control indistinguishable from each other. She said that she was worried about Simone being alone during the day while Raymond was at work. She said that pregnancy was hard and that the first trimester especially required rest and care and someone nearby in case anything went wrong. She said she wanted to come by every morning, just to check in, just to bring some breakfast, just to make sure Simone had everything she needed. And she would bring tea. Chamomile. Good for the nerves, she said. Good for the baby. Raymond, sitting at the end of the table, looked at his wife with an expression that was equal parts hope and appeal. The expression of a man who wanted very badly for two things to be true at the same time and who had not yet accepted that they could not be. Simone looked at Dorothy. She looked at Raymond. She thought about the daily phone calls and the vitamin opinions and the hospital preferences and the way the word something had landed in her chest that first night at dinner. She thought about all of those things. And then she said yes, because she was tired and she was nauseous, and she was 31 years old and pregnant and fundamentally decent. And the woman sitting across from her was her husband's mother. And sometimes decency asks things of us that we will later wish we had been less generous in giving. She said yes. And the next morning, at 8:15, Dorothy Beaumont knocked on the door for the first time. The first few weeks passed without incident. Dorothy arrived every morning at 8:15 with a canvas bag containing fruit, crackers, occasionally something warm from a container she had prepared at home. The tea came in the same ceramic travel mug every time, Dorothy's own, prepared before she left the house, already at the right temperature by the time she arrived. It was chamomile, she said, with a little honey. It tasted fine. It tasted, in fact, like exactly what it claimed to be, which is part of what made what was happening inside it so difficult to detect and so very easy to miss. Simone was not a suspicious woman by nature. She was a woman who had been raised to extend good faith to people until they gave her a concrete reason not to, and Dorothy Beaumont had not yet given her a reason that was concrete enough. Only reasons that were soft-edged and deniable and impossible to hold up in a conversation without sounding, as Raymond had already suggested she might sound, like a woman whose judgment was being compromised by the difficulty of her pregnancy. By month 3, Simone was not feeling well. Not dramatically. Not in the way that signals emergency. Not in the way that makes you reach for a phone in the middle of the night. It was subtler than that. A persistent fatigue that sat heavier than the ordinary exhaustion of early pregnancy. Headaches that arrived in the late morning and did not respond to the usual remedies. An occasional trembling in her hands that she noticed first when she was trying to hold a book and later when she was trying to hold a glass of water. She mentioned the fatigue to her OB at her 12-week appointment. Her OB ordered blood work. The results showed low iron, not uncommon in pregnancy, and her doctor increased her supplement dosage and told her to rest more and eat more leafy greens and come back in 4 weeks. Simone did all of these things. She did not feel better. She felt, if anything, incrementally worse as the weeks passed, in a way so gradual and so undramatic that it was almost impossible to point to and say, "This is wrong. This is not how this is supposed to feel." It felt instead like something being slowly turned down, like someone dimming a light so carefully and so patiently that by the time the room was dark you could not remember what full brightness had looked like. Dorothy, through all of this, was a constant presence. She began staying longer in the mornings. She rubbed Simone's feet. She made pronouncements about Simone's color. "She looks pale today," she told Raymond. "She needs more rest. She needs to slow down. She is pushing herself too hard." She began building, in these small daily observations, a portrait of Simone as fragile, a woman whose body was struggling, whose health was tenuous, who required careful watching. Raymond absorbed this portrait completely. He began treating his wife with a kind of protective hovering that would have been touching if it had been grounded in reality, but which was instead grounded in the reality Dorothy was constructing around him like a set. He suggested Simone stop going to yoga. He offered to handle the grocery shopping so she would not have to stand for long. He checked on her 3 times in the evenings in a way that made her feel, in the privacy of her own thoughts, less like a woman being loved and more like a woman being managed. And every morning Dorothy came through the door with the same canvas bag and the same ceramic mug and the same warm, practiced smile. And every morning Simone drank the tea, because it was there. Because refusing it every day required a kind of sustained resistance that her diminishing energy made increasingly difficult. Because the woman who brought it was her husband's mother and she was genuinely trying, to be fair. At month 5, she mentioned the trembling hands to her OB. Her doctor examined her carefully and ordered additional blood work, a broader panel this time. The results came back largely unremarkable. Her iron was still low despite the increased supplementation. Her doctor noted this as slightly unusual but not alarming and recommended a different formulation. She did not order a toxicology screen. There was no reason to order a toxicology screen. There was no reason, in the ordinary framework of a normal pregnancy being managed by a competent physician, to look for something that nobody had yet thought to look for. This is not a criticism of her doctor. It is, instead, a precise accounting of how well Dorothy Beaumont had planned what she was doing. How thoroughly she had understood that the most reliable cover for a slow and patient crime is the simple, human tendency to reach first for the most obvious explanation. At month 6, Simone had a conversation with her mother that she would later describe as the moment she came closest to naming what she could not yet prove. Gloria Washington drove over on a Wednesday afternoon and found her daughter on the couch, looking depleted in a way that she recognized immediately as more than ordinary pregnancy fatigue. She sat down next to her. She took her hands. She looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. And then she said, very quietly, "Simone, what is going on in this house? Not what is going on with your body. Not what did the doctor say. What is going on in this house?" Simone began to cry. Not dramatically, just a slow, quiet release of everything she had been holding at manageable levels for months. She told her mother about the fatigue and the headaches and the trembling. She told her about the daily visits and the daily tea and the way Dorothy's presence had reorganized the interior of her marriage without anyone ever acknowledging that it was happening. Gloria Washington listened to all of it without interrupting. When Simone was finished, Gloria sat with the silence for a moment, and then she asked one question. She said, "Do you ever see Dorothy drink the tea herself?" Simone stopped. She thought about it. 200 mornings. The same mug. The same ritual. She tried to remember a single morning when Dorothy had taken a sip from that mug herself. A single moment where the tea had touched anyone else's lips. She could not find one. She told her mother this. Gloria Washington nodded slowly. She did not say what she was thinking. She said instead that she was going to start coming over on the mornings that Dorothy did not come, and that Simone was not to drink anything she had not prepared herself, and that they were going to figure this out. Simone wanted to believe her mother was being dramatic. She went to sleep that night with the question sitting in the center of her chest like a stone she had not agreed to carry. The morning of the collapse was a Thursday in what would have been week 34 of the pregnancy. Dorothy had arrived at her usual time, delivered the tea with the usual warmth, and left earlier than normal. She mentioned a hair appointment, which was the kind of unremarkable detail that nobody would have thought to question or remember until later, when the timing of her departure became one of several things that Detective Phyllis Mercer found interesting. Simone had drunk the tea. She had moved to the kitchen to make herself something to eat. And at approximately 9:45 in the morning, standing between the kitchen counter and the refrigerator, her body simply stopped cooperating. Her legs gave out with no warning. She went down hard against the tile floor, conscious but unable to process what was happening quickly enough to reach for the counter. And she lay there for a moment that felt much longer than it was, her hands shaking with a violence they had never reached before, her vision narrowing at the edges. Her mouth unable to form the words she was trying to say at a volume loud enough for Raymond to hear from upstairs, where he was working from home that day. He heard the fall. He came downstairs and found her on the floor and called 911 immediately. And his voice on that call, recorded, as all such calls are, contained a quality of panic that would later be described by one of the investigating officers as the sound of a man who was genuinely shocked. Which was, the officer noted carefully in her report, a detail worth thinking about. The paramedics arrived in 7 minutes. They stabilized Simone, assessed the baby's heart rate, which was stressed but present, and began preparing to transport. And in the ambulance, somewhere between the house in Westerville and the hospital, Simone Carter reached out and grabbed the arm of the paramedic closest to her and said something that was logged in the official transport record, and that would become, in the weeks and months that followed, the single most important sentence in the entire case. She said, "It is the tea. Something is wrong with the tea." The paramedic noted it, marked it as possible confusion secondary to trauma from the fall, logged it, and moved on, because there were more immediate things to attend to, and because the explanation that presented itself first, a difficult pregnancy, a bad fall, a woman in distress, was the explanation that fit the visible facts. Simone Carter arrived at Columbus Regional Hospital at 10:22 in the morning. She was 34 weeks pregnant. She was conscious and terrified and holding onto the side of the gurney with both hands as they wheeled her through the doors, and the one thought she would later say she could not get out of her mind, even through all of the chaos and the noise and the fear of that morning, was the taste of chamomile that was still sitting at the back of her throat. Dr. Anita Osei had been practicing emergency medicine for 11 years. She was 43 years old, precise in the way that the best emergency physicians are, not cold, but economical, someone who had learned to move through complexity quickly and to trust the details that other people passed over. She was the attending physician on duty when Simone Carter came in that morning, and she reviewed the chart, ran the standard assessments, monitored the baby's vitals, and was preparing to order the predictable panel of tests when she scrolled back to the transport record and read the paramedic's note. "It is the tea. Something is wrong with the tea." She read it twice. She looked at Simone, who was lying in the hospital bed with her eyes open and her jaw set in the particular way that people hold themselves when they are frightened but determined not to show it completely. Dr. Osei asked her one question. She said, "Tell me about the tea." And Simone told her. All of it. 8 months. Every morning. The same mug. The same woman. The fatigue that had been building since month 3. The headaches. The trembling. The fact that she had never once seen Dorothy Beaumont take a sip from that mug herself. Dr. Osei listened to all of it without writing anything down, which Simone would later say was the thing that told her she was finally being heard. When she was finished, Dr. Osei stood up and added one test to the order. A comprehensive toxicology panel that was not part of the standard prenatal workup and that most emergency physicians would not have thought to run. It took 48 hours for the results to come back. In those 48 hours, Simone delivered her daughter, 6 weeks early, for pounds and 9 ounces, lungs working, heart beating, voice already loud enough to fill the room. And the baby was moved to the NICU and Simone was moved to a recovery room and Raymond sat in a chair beside her bed and held her hand and did not sleep. And Dorothy Beaumont came to the hospital and sat in the waiting room and told the nurses she was the grandmother and asked if there was anything she could do to help. When the toxicology results came back on the second day, Dr. Anita Osei read them in her office. She read them once, carefully, all the way through. Then she read them again. Then she picked up her phone and called the main line for the Columbus Police Department and asked to be connected to the detective division. She did not speak to Simone first. She did not speak to Raymond. She called the police because what was in that report was not ambiguous and was not the result of anything that happened by accident. And she had been a physician long enough to understand the difference between a body that had been damaged by circumstance and a body that had been damaged by intention. Simone Carter's blood work showed sustained elevated concentrations of compounds consistent with prolonged ingestion of pennyroyal and blue cohosh, 2 plant-based substances with a long and documented history of use as abortifacients. Substances that, in the concentrated doses the blood panel suggested had been administered over an extended period, could cause neurological disruption, premature labor, and, if the exposure had continued or intensified, organ failure. Someone had been adding concentrated herbal compounds to Simone Carter's tea. Not once, not by accident, for months, systematically, patiently, by someone who understood exactly what they were doing and who had calculated, with cold precision, how much time they needed and how much damage was required to accomplish what they were trying to accomplish. Detective Phyllis Mercer arrived at Columbus Regional Hospital on the morning of the 3rd day. She was 51 years old, 22 years on the force, the last 9 of those in the detective division handling crimes that lived inside families. The crimes that were hardest to see because they happened in the spaces where trust was supposed to make sight unnecessary. She had a reputation among her colleagues for 2 things: patience and the ability to sit across from someone who was lying to her and make them feel, for long enough, that she believed them. She reviewed Dr. Osei's report in full before she spoke to anyone. She reviewed the paramedic's transport note. She pulled the hospital visitor log and confirmed that Dorothy Beaumont had been present in the waiting room on 2 of the 3 days since Simone's admission. Then she went to Simone's room. She sat down, introduced herself, and said she had a few questions. Simone looked at her and said, "You read the report." Mercer said she had. Simone said, "Then you know it was the tea." Mercer said she did. And then she said something that Simone Carter would later say was the first moment in 8 months that she felt, fully and without qualification, that she was being taken seriously by someone with the power to do something about what had been done to her. Mercer said, "I know, and I'm going to need you to tell me everything you can remember, starting from the very first morning." Simone told her everything. The conversations she had logged in her phone's notes app. She had started doing this at month 6, after the conversation with Gloria, recording the details of Dorothy's visits in a private note that she had not mentioned to Raymond because she had not yet been able to fully face what the documentation was suggesting. The dates, the times, the things Dorothy had said, the mornings she had arrived, the mornings she had stayed late, the single consistent detail that had run through every morning of 8 months without exception. The tea was always prepared before Dorothy left her own house, always arrived in Dorothy's mug, and Dorothy had never once consumed a single drop of it herself. Mercer photographed the notes on Simone's phone with Simone's permission. She added them to her file. Then she drove to the house in Westerville, where Raymond was, and she sat down across from him at the kitchen table and told him, in plain language, what the toxicology report had found. She described the compounds. She explained what they could do. She watched his face as she spoke. And what she saw on Raymond Beaumont's face in that moment was not the thing she was expecting. She was expecting shock. What she got was something that looked, in her professional estimation, more like the controlled expression of a man confirming something he had already been afraid was true. She asked him directly, "Mr. Beaumont, did you have any knowledge that something was being added to the tea your mother brought your wife?" Raymond was quiet for a very long time, long enough that the silence itself became an answer, even before the words arrived. He said no. He said he hadn't known. He said he couldn't believe his mother would do something like that. His eyes went to the table as he said these things. Not to the floor. To the table. Mercer noted in her report that eye contact broke in the direction of a fixed surface at the moment of the denial, which was consistent, in her experience, with a person managing the gap between what they were saying and what they knew. She thanked him for his time. She did not tell him what she was going to do next. She drove from the house in Westerville to a record search that would take 4 hours and would produce the single piece of physical evidence that changed the shape of the entire case. Dorothy Beaumont had made a purchase 9 weeks before the tea deliveries began. An online order, placed through a credit card in her own name, from a bulk herbal supplement distributor. The order included 2 items. The first was a large quantity of concentrated pennyroyal extract, a substance that, the website noted in its product description, was not for use during pregnancy. The second was a quantity of blue cohosh powder. The combined total of the order was sufficient, according to the forensic botanist who would later testify at trial, to administer a low but accumulating daily dose over a period of 6 to 9 months without producing effects dramatic enough to raise immediate clinical alarm. It was, the forensic expert said, a careful order. It was the order of someone who had done research. Someone who had looked up dosages and timelines and the expected presentation of symptoms, and who had then purchased exactly what was required to stay beneath the threshold of obvious detection for as long as possible. Detective Mercer requested a warrant for Dorothy Beaumont's home the same evening. Inside a cabinet in Dorothy's bathroom, behind a row of standard over-the-counter medications, the executing officers found 2 nearly empty containers, one of pennyroyal extract, one of blue cohosh powder. Both consistent with the compounds identified in Simone Carter's blood work, both with purchase dates matching the online order. Dorothy Beaumont was taken into custody that evening. She was cooperative. She was calm. She held her chin level and looked at the arresting officers with the expression of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the preceding days, exactly what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. The interrogation room at the Columbus Police Department was small and functional in the way that such rooms always are. A table, chairs, a mirror, lighting that has never once in its existence been described as flattering. Dorothy Beaumont sat across from Detective Mercer in her good coat, her reading glasses on the beaded chain, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She had requested an attorney and had been advised of her rights. Her attorney, a man named Gerald Finch who specialized in family law and who had clearly been called on short notice, sat beside her with an expression that suggested he was already aware his client was going to be difficult to manage. Mercer placed the purchase record on the table. She placed the forensic toxicology report beside it. She placed the lab analysis of the contents found in Dorothy's bathroom cabinet beside that. She did not say anything immediately. She let Dorothy look at the documents for a long moment. Then she asked her one question. She said, "Mrs. Beaumont." "What?" Dorothy looked at the documents. She looked at Mercer. She looked at her attorney, who gave her the particular look that defense attorneys give clients when they are attempting, without words, to communicate that saying nothing is always an option. Dorothy Beaumont did not take that option. She straightened slightly in her chair, and she looked at Detective Mercer, and she said, "I was not trying to hurt her." Mercer waited. Dorothy continued. She said that the amounts she had used were small. She said that she had researched them carefully. She said that she had not intended any lasting harm. And then she said the thing that stopped the room, the thing that Detective Mercer would describe in her testimony as the most chilling moment of an investigation she had been conducting for 22 years. Dorothy Beaumont looked at the detective and said, in a voice that was entirely level, entirely composed, "I just needed her to lose it early enough. Early enough that Raymond could start over. With someone who was right for him." She was not talking about Simone. She was talking about the baby. Her own grandchild. A child she had never met, who was at that moment in a NICU isolette 4 miles away with sensors on her chest, and a tube in her nose, had been, in Dorothy Beaumont's calculation, not a grandchild at all. She had been an obstacle, a complication in a plan that Dorothy had made for her son's life without her son's knowledge or consent. And Dorothy had spent 8 months trying to remove that obstacle with the patience and the thoroughness of someone who had convinced herself, so completely and so catastrophically, that what she was doing was love. Gerald Finch put his hand on his client's arm. He said they were done answering questions. Mercer gathered her documents without changing her expression. She stood, thanked them for their time, and walked out of the room. In the hallway, she stopped and stood still for a moment. 22 years. She had been doing this for 22 years. And she still, in moments like this one, needed a few seconds alone with the full weight of what human beings were capable of doing to each other in the name of the things they loved. The charges against Dorothy Beaumont were filed 10 days after her arrest. Aggravated assault, felony poisoning, attempted fetal homicide, a charge that existed under Ohio law and that carried, for the prosecutor who filed it, a particular significance. Dorothy's attorney immediately moved to contest the fetal homicide charge on the grounds that the baby had survived and that intent was difficult to establish definitively. The prosecutor, a woman named Catherine Hollis who had spent 15 years trying cases that involved violence against women and children, anticipated every one of these arguments and had prepared for them with the particular thoroughness of someone who understood that the defense's entire strategy was going to rest on the word intended. Dorothy had not intended to harm anyone, Finch would argue. She had used natural herbal substances in quantities she believed were safe. The effects had been unintended. The pregnancy had continued. The baby had survived. Finch was a competent attorney. His arguments were not frivolous. They were exactly the arguments that the law made available to him, and he made them with the precision and the persistence that competent defense attorneys are supposed to bring to the most difficult facts. Catherine Hollis, in response, put Dr. Anita Osei on the stand and walked her through the toxicology findings in language simple enough for every juror in the room to understand. She put the forensic botanist on the stand and had him explain, in meticulous detail, why the dosage and duration of the exposure were inconsistent with any interpretation of the word accidental. She put the online purchase record in front of the jury and pointed to the date, 9 weeks before the first cup of tea, and asked them to consider what kind of preparation that represented. And then she called one final witness that no one in Dorothy Beaumont's legal team had been prepared for. She called Raymond Beaumont. Raymond had, in the weeks since his mother's arrest, retained his own attorney. He had been advised not to speak publicly. He had complied with that advice in every respect except one. He had told his own attorney the truth. And his attorney, a man who had spent 30 years practicing law in Columbus and who had a functional understanding of the difference between a client he could protect and a situation he could not, had advised Raymond that the truthful path was, at this point, the only path that made any sense. Raymond Beaumont took the stand in his mother's trial and told the jury that 6 weeks before Simone's collapse, he had found a container of concentrated herbal supplement powder in his mother's bathroom during a family visit. He had read the label. He had noticed, in the product description, a warning specifically contraindicated for use during pregnancy. He had looked up the compound on his phone. He had read enough to understand what it could do. He had stood in his mother's bathroom for a long time. And then he had put the container back where he found it and walked out of the bathroom and driven home to his wife and said nothing. He had told himself it was probably something Dorothy was taking for herself. He had told himself the amounts in the tea were certainly too small to cause real harm. He had told himself that his mother loved Simone, that she was difficult but not dangerous, that he was overreacting, that bringing it up would cause a conflict that he did not know how to manage, and that might permanently fracture the two most important relationships in his life. He had told himself these things every morning for 6 weeks while his wife drank from a cup his mother brought. He was crying by the end of his testimony. The jury watched him cry. Catherine Hollis did not offer him any comfort. She had not called him to be comforted. She had called him because his testimony made one thing permanently, irreversibly clear. Dorothy Beaumont had not acted in a vacuum. She had acted in a family system that had been conditioned, over decades, to look away from the things she did not want examined. And the cost of that conditioning had been paid, in the end, not by Dorothy and not by Raymond, but by the woman who had married into that system in good faith and who had spent 8 months being slowly harmed by it while the people around her found reasons not to see what was directly in front of them. The jury deliberated for 11 hours across 2 days. They asked to review the toxicology report twice. They asked to review the purchase record once. On the morning of the second day, at 10:47, they returned to the courtroom. Gloria Washington was in the gallery. She had been there every day. She was sitting behind Simone, and when the foreperson stood to read the verdict, Gloria reached forward and put her hand on her daughter's shoulder and left it there. Dorothy Beaumont was convicted on all 3 counts: aggravated assault, felony poisoning, attempted fetal homicide. She stood while the verdict was read with her chin at the same level it had been in the interrogation room, steady, composed, the expression of a woman who had decided how she was going to hold herself through this regardless of the outcome. If the verdict broke something in her, it did not break it visibly. Not in that room. Not in front of those people. Not in front of Simone Carter, who sat at the plaintiff's table and looked straight ahead and breathed slowly and let the words land one by one without moving. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. Dorothy Beaumont received 14 years, with eligibility for parole after 9. Her attorney filed an immediate notice of appeal. The appeal would eventually be denied on every ground. Raymond Beaumont was not charged with the underlying poisoning. He was, however, charged with criminal negligence and failure to report a known crime. Charges that, after a separate proceeding, resulted in 3 years of probation, mandatory psychological treatment, and a family court order restricting his contact with his daughter until a judge reviewed the case individually. He did not contest any of it. He sat in his own proceeding with the expression of a man who understood, finally and too late, the full weight of every morning he had chosen silence over his wife's safety. His attorney noted in his closing statement that Raymond Beaumont was a man who had been failed by his own upbringing in ways that had made him incapable, in the critical moment, of doing what was right. Catherine Hollis, in her response, said that incapability and innocence were not the same thing, and that the woman who had nearly died in a hospital bed as a result of that incapability deserved to have that distinction made clearly and on the record. Simone Carter was discharged from Columbus Regional Hospital on a Friday morning, 22 days after she had been brought in through the emergency entrance. She left in a wheelchair as is standard, with Gloria Washington walking beside her and a nurse holding the door. She did not go back to the house in Westerville. She went to her mother's house, where she had a room with good light and a window that looked out onto Gloria's garden, and she stayed there for 6 weeks while her body recalibrated and her daughter grew stronger in the NICU down the road. She visited the hospital twice a day. She sat beside the isolette and talked to her daughter, not about the case, not about Dorothy, not about Raymond, but about small and ordinary things. The garden at Gloria's house, a book she was reading, the specific quality of the light on a Tuesday afternoon in October that she had always loved. She talked to her daughter the way you talk to someone you have chosen entirely and whom you intend to keep, which is the most fundamental act of love that a human being can perform. The baby came home on a Thursday. She was 5 pounds and 2 ounces. She was loud and she was healthy, and she had, according to every physician who examined her, no lasting effects from the 8 months of exposure. The body's resilience, when it belongs to someone who was wanted and fought for, is a thing that defies easy explanation. But Simone Carter, who had spent the better part of a year having her own body's signals dismissed and overridden by everyone around her, looked at her daughter and understood it without needing it explained. She named her Maya. Maya Gloria Carter, her own last name, her mother's name in the middle, a name that belonged entirely to the two of them and to no one else. She filed for divorce from the hospital room before she was discharged, while Raymond's signature on the consent form for their daughter's middle name was still drying on the page. Her attorney handled everything. Raymond signed without contesting. He sent a letter 6 months later, 4 handwritten pages that arrived in an envelope with no return address. Simone read it once, sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment she had found in the short north neighborhood of Columbus. Then she folded it and put it in a drawer and did not take it out again. Not because she was angry, though she had every right to be, but because there was nothing in those 4 pages that changed what had happened or what she now understood about the architecture of the family she had married into. Some letters are written for the person sending them, not the person receiving them. Simone Carter understood the difference. She left the letter in the drawer and went back to her daughter, who was on the living room floor attempting, with considerable determination and limited success, to roll over. Dorothy Beaumont began serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. She maintained, through the appeals process and in the various statements her attorney released on her behalf, that she had never intended harm, that she had loved her son, that she had acted out of fear, that the system had not accounted for the complexity of what she had been going through. These statements were received with the silence they deserved by everyone who had sat in that courtroom and heard her explain, in her own words, in her own voice, that she had wanted the baby gone early enough that Raymond could start over with someone better. No legal argument crafted after the fact can fully override a confession made in a moment of composure. Dorothy had said what she meant. She had meant what she said. And the 14-year sentence that followed was the system's accounting of that fact, however long the appeals took to exhaust. Her church circle sent cards for the first year. By the second year, the cards had stopped. By the third year, the people who had known Dorothy Beaumont as a woman who brought casseroles and remembered birthdays had reorganized their understanding of her in the permanent and irreversible way that the truth, once it is fully known, reorganizes everything it touches. Raymond Beaumont completed his probation without violation. He entered therapy, not because the court required it specifically, but because his therapist, whom he began seeing voluntarily 3 months after his own proceeding, told him in their second session that he was never going to understand what had happened or prevent it from happening in some form again until he was willing to examine, honestly, and without the protections he had spent his entire life constructing, what his relationship with his mother had actually been. It was the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. It took years. He would later say, in the only interview he ever gave, a brief, carefully considered conversation with a journalist writing a longer piece on family systems and psychological control, that the most painful realization of the entire process was not learning what his mother had done. It was learning that he had always, on some level, known that she was capable of something like it. That the version of his mother he had been protecting all his life was not a real person but a construction, a story he had agreed to maintain because the truth was more than he had known how to hold. He said this quietly and without self-pity, which was the most honest thing he had ever said about himself, and which came far too late to matter to the person it had cost the most. He sends a card for Maya's birthday every year. A simple card, not elaborate. Simone reads them. She has not shown them to Maya yet. Maya is 4 years old. She is in a phase of absolute obsession with dinosaurs, specifically the herbivores, which she finds more interesting than the predators, and which she can name with an accuracy that routinely astonishes adults who underestimate her. She calls her grandmother Nana G, which is short for something only the two of them fully understand. She goes to a preschool 2 blocks from the apartment and has a best friend named Jasper who brings her goldfish crackers every Tuesday, and whose mother is one of the people Simone has coffee with on Saturday mornings. Her life is ordinary in all the specific ways that ordinary is another word for safe. She does not know yet what she almost was not. She does not need to know yet. There is time for that later, for the careful, honest conversation that Simone has already begun to prepare herself to have when Maya is old enough to receive it. For now, what Maya knows is that her mother shows up every morning without fail, that the apartment is warm, that Nana G answers the phone every time, that she is, without question or condition, wanted. These are the things that matter most. These are the things that Simone Carter made sure of first, before she worried about anything else. There is something that Dr. Anita Osei said in an interview conducted several months after the trial that has stayed with everyone who heard it. She was asked why she ordered the toxicology panel, the non-standard test that broke the case open. She said that she ordered it because a woman in the back of an ambulance had said something that the people around her had noted and moved past, and that it was her job, when someone told her something was wrong, to believe them until the evidence said otherwise rather than dismiss them until the evidence said she should not have. She said it plainly, without drama, in the manner of someone describing the obvious. But it was not obvious. It was, in the full context of everything that had preceded it, 8 months of Simone's signals being overridden, explained away, attributed to hormones and sensitivity and the ordinary difficulties of pregnancy, one of the most radical acts of the entire story. Dr. Osei simply listened. She simply believed the woman in front of her. She simply ran one additional test. And those three small things, listening, believing, testing, were what stood between Simone Carter and a version of this story that ended very differently. This is what the case of Dorothy Beaumont ultimately teaches us, if we are willing to sit with it long enough to hear what it is actually saying. It is not a story about a monster. Monsters are easy. They announce themselves. They do not bring chamomile tea in a ceramic mug every morning for 8 months. They do not sit in waiting rooms and ask how they can help. What Dorothy Beaumont was is something harder to name and more important to recognize. A person who had organized her entire interior life around a single relationship to the exclusion of everyone else's reality, including the reality of a child she had helped create. A person whose love had curdled, over decades of unchecked intensity, into something that looked like devotion but functioned like ownership. And the system that allowed her to operate, the family system, the social system, the medical system, all of the systems that had looked at Simone Carter for 8 months and reached for the most convenient explanation rather than the true one. That system is not one person's failure. It is a pattern old enough and common enough that we have built entire structures of assumption around it. Structures that make it possible for someone like Dorothy Beaumont to walk through a front door every morning carrying poison and to be thanked for her kindness. The question that this case leaves with us is not whether we would have seen it coming. Most of us would not have. The question is what we do with the knowledge that we might not have. What we do with the information that the most dangerous harm sometimes comes in the form of the things we are most conditioned to accept without examination. What do you do when someone brings you kindness every single morning and something inside you, something below the level of words, keeps asking what is in the cup? Simone Carter's answer, the answer she arrived at after everything, is this: you listen to that something. You trust it above the explanations. You trust it above the convenience of not wanting to believe what it is telling you. You trust it because it is yours, because it belongs to you in a way that no one else's account of your experience ever can, and because the cost of ignoring it, as Simone Carter learned over 243 mornings of chamomile tea, is a cost that no one should ever be asked to pay. Maya Gloria Carter, 4 years old, obsessed with herbivorous dinosaurs, will grow up in a home where she is taught to trust the quiet voice inside her that knows when something is not right. She will be taught this not as a lesson but as an atmosphere, the way certain things are absorbed rather than instructed, carried in the marrow of a childhood rather than recorded in its notebooks. She will learn it from a woman who learned it the hardest possible way, and she will carry it forward into a life that her grandmother tried to prevent and that exists anyway, fully and irreversibly, as proof that the things built on truth outlast the things built on control. Every single time. We want to hear from you before you go. Drop your city in the comments right now. Where are you watching from today? And tell us honestly, at what point in this story did you first suspect Dorothy Beaumont? Was it the wedding toast? The daily visits? The moment Gloria Washington asked whether Dorothy ever drank the tea herself? Because we have been asking everyone, and the answers are more divided than you might expect. Leave your city and your answer below. We read every single comment on this channel, and we want to know what you think. If MindMaze Stories is new to you today, hit the subscribe button right now because what we have coming next on this channel is going to stay with you for a long time after you finish watching, and you do not want to find out about it from someone else.